Okay, so today we will be talking about respiratory regulation. So respiratory regulation, we have to know before respiratory regulation, you have to know three important things. So you have midbrain, pons, and medulla. So in midbrain, for example, you have the pneumotaxic center. Now, what is the function of the pneumotaxic center is that it allows the transition from inspiration to expiration. For example, if you're inspiring, you have to expire. The transition from inspiration to expiration is the pneumotaxic center. That is in the midbrain. And next is the apneustic center. Apneustic center is nothing but you trigger that is prolonged inspiration. Apneusis is what? See, apneusis is there is this apneustic center has no role in normal respiration. Apneusis is not is prolonged inspiration. See, the prolonged inspire. So that is what the only thing it does is prolonged inspiration. Now, if we come down further down in the medulla, you have the dorsal respiratory ganglion and the ventral respiratory center. The dorsal respiratory center, ventral respiratory center. Now, the dorsal respiratory center is very close to the central chemoreceptors. The central chemoreceptors is what is going to activate the dorsal respiratory center. Now, this dorsal respiratory ganglion or the dorsal respiratory center is very close. As I told you, it's close to the central chemoreceptors. It's also close to the nucleus tractus solitarius. So it will receive what are the receptors which will stimulate the dorsal respiratory center is this pulmonary receptors, the stretch receptors, the proprioception and juxtacapillary, which I'll be talking about later, and also the central and peripheral receptors. Now the ventral has the ventral respiratory ganglion has four important parts. One is the Botzinger complex, which will control only expiration. It will control only expiration. Another one is the pre-Botzinger complex. See, here I'm telling you again. It's a pneumotaxic center which will allow transition from inspiration to expiration, and then there's an apneustic center which will trigger only prolonged inspiration, and then we have the dorsal, which is very close to the nucleus tractus solitarius, and here the ventral. The ventral has the expiratory part, that is only the Botzinger, and the inspiratory part, that is the pre-Botzinger complex. That is, it is a pacemaker of respiration. What do you mean by pacemaker of respiration is the rate and depth of respiration. So you respire, that is you breathe 12 to 16 breaths per minute, right? A normal person, that is what it does. The rate and depth is controlled by this. And now the other two are nucleus retroambiguous and nucleus ambiguous. That is not important. Now, again, I'm coming here. So what happens is, any impulse which will activate the central chemoreceptors will activate the dorsal will activate the dorsal respiratory center, and that dorsal respiratory center will also in turn activate the ventral respiratory center, and together it will come down. So it will create action potentials. These action potentials together will come down to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, these are all only inspiratory fibers. These inspiratory fibers, and then these will come to the spinal cord, and this will again further increase the action potentials. Now these nerves are the diaphragmatic nerves, which is C3, C4 and C5, and also from T1 to T11, which is the intercostal nerves. See, okay, T1 to T11, which is the intercostal nerves. So this is normal respiration. Okay, and what are the controls we have is, I'll tell you once again. Okay. What are the controls that we have is, the apneustic center has control over the DRG and the VRG. The apneustic will always have a control over DRG and VRG, and similarly the pneumotaxic center will also have a control over the DRG and VRG. Now what happens is, what we should know is, what regulates the respiration. Okay, now what regulates the respiration is, see, Okay, what regulates the respiration? As I told you, the pneumotaxic center has a direct control over the DRG, and it also has a direct control over the VRG, and the apneustic center will also have control over everything. Now, the pneumotaxic center, which allows the transition from inspiration and expiration, will will also be excited by the central chemoreceptors. Now there are two types of central receptors. You have the central chemoreceptors and you have the peripheral chemoreceptors. Now the central chemoreceptors, they sense changes only in increase in protons, which is present in the CSF. If this is the blood and this is the CSF, so there will be increase in CO2. Protons cannot directly move into the CSF. Now increase in CO2 somehow, this is the regular thing, cross the blood brain, CO2 will cross the blood brain barrier, bicarbonic acid will be formed and protons will be formed. If increased H plus is present, that means there is decrease in pH, that is acidic. In case of metabolic acidosis, for example, metabolic or respiratory acidosis, whatever it is, in acidotic condition, this H plus will activate the central chemoreceptors. This central chemoreceptors will activate the dorsal respiratory nucleus, and it also activate the pneumotaxic center. Now the dorsal respiratory nucleus, anyway the pneumotaxic center will again further activate the dorsal respiratory nucleus. Now this again activates the ventral respiratory nucleus. Now what happens is, see, there is increase in PCO2, that is again an respiratory acidosis. It will change. What will happen is, along the VRG, it will activate the inspiratory neurons and will increase the it's the same thing, it will activate, it goes, the action potentials will increase, everything will increase. So the diaphragm will start hyper contracting, so the frequency of contraction will increase. So there is hyperventilation, increase in respiratory rate and increase in depth. So this is what happens here in case of central chemoreceptors. This peripheral chemoreceptors, that's another type of receptors. Here, see what it's the same thing that I told you. The central chemoreceptors will activate the DRG, and the DRG will activate the VRG, and the VRG will activate the pre-Boltzinger complex, which is a pacemaker of respiration. So the inspiration frequency of inspiration increases, so diaphragm and accessory muscles will start hyperactivating. So you will have hyperventilation, or you can also say there's an increase in respiratory rate or increase in depth. So this is in central chemoreceptors. Now in case of peripheral chemoreceptors, we have two types of receptors. That is, we have receptors present in the carotid body, and we have receptors present in the aortic body. Now in the carotid body, see, we have a carotid body which is present at the bifurcation of the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery, or around right common carotid artery, and we have the aortic bodies which is present between the left aorta and the left atrium and the descending aorta. Now what happens here, now these peripheral chemoreceptors that we talked about, they receive senses from PCO2, PO2 and pH. Before telling you that, see, PCO2, that is partial pressure of carbon dioxide, is a powerful stimulator for any hyperventilation or hypoventilation, unless oxygen levels comes down less than 16 millimeter of mercury. See, in central chemoreceptors, the main component is the partial pressure of oxygen. If it is less than 60, it will instantly activate the peripheral chemoreceptors. Also, CO2 will activate, and pH also will activate. But here, the pH is not going to be activated by any protons that are present, like from that is, it doesn't activate the protons that are coming from the carbonic acid. It activates only the protons that happens due to changes in the metabolism. That is, when you have lactic acid more in number, or when you have ketone bodies more in number, that is what is going to activate the pH in case of peripheral receptors. Now once it happens, if the peripheral, all these things are activated, what happens is that this carotid bodies have two types of cells. It has the succentacular cells and glomus cells. The succentacular cells and glomus cells is very important. I'll show you what these glomus cells are. Okay. One second. Okay, see. So we have the subcentacular cells and the glomus cells. Now what happens is, in the glomus cells, you have a potassium channel and you have many neurosecretory granules, that is vesicles like dopamine. This dopamine is very important. Now what happens in these subcentacular cells, this potassium channel is important. And there's, for example, we'll talk about acidosis, metabolic acidosis. In metabolic acidosis, you have more of lactic acid, more of ketone bodies. What will happen? It will inhibit the potassium channel. Also, when you have O2 component is very less than 60, it will inhibit the potassium channel. Again, from CO2, the protons will be less, it will inhibit the potassium channel. If this is inhibited, what happens is, if this is inhibited, the potassium is going to start accumulating. If this is inhibited, potassium is going to start accumulating here. So the dopamine will start releasing. Now how does this dopamine release? There is something called calcium channels. These calcium channels will start entering here and the dopamine will release. This dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Now what happens is, the carotid body and aortic bodies are connected to neurons, particular neurons. The carotid body is connected to 9th nerve and the aortic body is connected to the 10th nerve. Now these two nerves, they will again go into the dorsal root ganglion and they will activate the ventral respiratory center. So the dorsal respiratory center will activate the ventral respiratory center. So inspiration will increase, the frequency of action potential will increase, and there will be hyperventilation or hyperapnea. So this is what happens in metabolic acidosis. The reverse happens in metabolic alkalosis. In metabolic alkalosis, the pH will be high, okay, and the PCO2 will be low. If the pH is high due to bases, what happens? The potassium, if the pH is high is in the base, what happens? Everything will be opposite. See, the potassium channel will get activated, so all the potassium will go out. So there's no more potassium inside. So the dopamine will remain inside the glomus cells. The dopamine is not going to activate the 9th and 10th nerve. So there will be decrease in action potentials, and you will have slow breathing, shallow and slow breathing in case of metabolic alkalosis. So this is what happens in respiratory regulation. So all you have to know is these centers: pneumotaxic function, transition from inspiration to expiration, apneustic, which will be, apneustic has no role in normal inspiration, as I told you. It's only triggered in case of prolonged inspiration. So generally we don't have prolonged inspiration because this pneumotoxic will keep inhibiting this, okay, and same thing. That's it.